Sorry?
Phil will join us shortly.
And Phil, which Phil? Phil Reid is on his way as well. Cool. Thank you, John. The other thing, because of questions from, I've had a few emails and also councillors, the tables, which we'll go through a bit more, what we're doing today is working out where we reduce. High-level principles of where we may reduce capacity. There is no direction in here of increasing areas. I mean, I guess everyone's well, technically you would be able to, but the direction of this paper is the principles of where you reduce. This is not about increasing anywhere on paper that is already in Plan Change 120. It's not about increasing anyone's capacity that is, we're not changing Plan Change 120 upwards anywhere. There may be places, clearly, the direction we've heard from councillors in the workshop, people would like to decrease towards that 1.6. Those tables are about how we work towards 120 to begin with, and now this discussion is about where those decreases might come from. This is not about moving decreases to increase in other people's areas. I want to make that really clear. Some people were freaked out when they saw those tables about changing things more from 120. This is about where the decreases may happen in a principled way. Thanks, John.
Right. Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, members of the committee. So, as you recall from the workshop last week and from previous discussions, the government has signalled some potential changes to the parameters around PC 120. PC 120, as you know, was notified for submissions prior to Christmas. The submission period closed a few days before Christmas. We had 10,500 submissions. Our team are working their way through the submissions as we're required to do to prepare a summary of the 10,500 submissions. So what I'll do is just a quick recap on the signal from the government, and in particular Minister Bishop, around the parameters that are likely to change for Plan Change 120, and then I'll move on to a quick recap on how we developed Plan Change 120, and then onto the recommended principles for how we may look to amend PC 120 when the legislation passes through. So, in terms of the signals from government, and in particular the Minister for Resource Management Act reform and other matters, other portfolios, as we understand it, the things that are changing is that the requirement to achieve the same or more capacity as proposed Plan Change 78, the predecessor to PC 120, is going to be amended, and that would require a change to the Resource Management Act. It's not something that the government can do without taking that through a full parliamentary process and changing the RMA. So that change to the RMA has also been signalled. There has been a request from Minister Bishop for some initial information from the Council on the approach that the Council would take if the legislation does pass, which is certainly the government's intention. And the key signal there is that the requirement to achieve the same or more capacity as Plan Change 78, that's the full build-up maximum theoretical number of homes that you could build under Plan Change 78, was sitting at about 2 million. That was the legal requirement for Plan Change 120. That requirement has been signalled as reducing from 2 million down to at least 1.6 million. So what that means is that the Council could amend Plan Change 120 to reduce the capacity somewhere between 1.6 million and the current requirement in the law, which is the 2 million. Ministers also signalled that there would be an opportunity for new people who are not submitters on PC 120 to join the process, and I guess that's a natural justice fairness issue if the Council is going to take up this opportunity and the additional flexibility and reduce some of the heights and densities in Plan Change 120 in certain locations. Then there will be some submitters who aren't participants at the moment who may wish to join and say they think that's a good thing or a bad thing, or come up with some other alternative. So government has signalled there would be a process so that it's not just the 10,500 who've got involved to date. There would be a fairness, natural justice opportunity for others to get involved in some way, shape or form. Maybe not in the normal way of submitting on a plan change, maybe some alternative, and that's the detail that we haven't yet seen, but the signal is that there would be that opportunity to get involved and turn up at the hearings, present your case at the hearings and influence the final outcome. after the hearings. What we understand is not going to change is the requirement to implement the core intensification parts of NPS urban development that have been around for a number of years. They were a core requirement for Plan Change 78, they're a core requirement for PC 120, and our understanding is that those will continue to be a core requirement. They are outlined in Table 1 of the agenda report, and they include allowing at least 6 stories to be built in and around the city centre, the 10 or 11 metropolitan centres, all of the rapid transit stations, that's the heavy rail bus stations and stations on the northern and eastern busways. So those requirements in NPSUD will remain unchanged, that enabling at least 6 stories. And NPS urban development also talks about those smaller centres, so not the 10 or 11, and I say or 11, it's 11 now. We have the Drury Centre is the 11th metro centre. There's also a requirement around the smaller town and local centres across the region, of which there are about 65 or 70 or so, to enable a level of intensification in line with the range of goods and services and really goods and services that those centres provide. So they are of differing scales, as we all know, across from north, south, east, west, central, across the region. Those local town centres have different offerings, different accessibility in terms of public transport and so on. But NPSUD does say that we have to have a response that enables intensification around those centres. So that's unchanged. In the RMA itself, so not NPS urban development, but actually hardwired into the Resource Management Act is a requirement to allow for 15 stories or more around 3 stations on the western heavy rail line, and to allow for 10 or more stories around the stations also on the western line. I won't name the stations, I think you're fairly familiar with the 5 stations. So that's been signalled as not changing through the Minister's speech, not in the letter, but in the speech that he gave a couple of weeks ago at the Committee for Auckland. City centre and metro centres, this is a bit of a technical issue, but in terms of how we calculate as council whether we've achieved the 2 million or the 1.6 or whatever other figure council chooses to, I guess, lock things in with any amendments, we will be able to contribute the uplift in capacity between the city centre as it was in the operative unitary plan and where it ended up off the back of Plan Change 78. So City Centre, for those who may not recall, went through the hearings under Plan Change 78, extensive expert evidence, legal submissions, other submissions. Panel spent many, many days considering all of the submissions and evidence and made recommendations to Council on the City Centre. And there is an uplift in capacity, an increase in capacity between what used to be in the unitary plan for the City Centre and what's in the unitary plan now. So that increase in capacity can contribute towards the overall capacity, which I guess does give council a bit more flexibility. That's been confirmed. And we also have, I think, 9 of the metro centres, 8 or 9, have also gone through that process. They've had the hearings, there have been some decisions. There are some fairly modest increases in the capacity in those metro centres, but that can also count towards the overall total capacity, which does give the council a little bit more flexibility than we perhaps had when PC 120 was prepared middle of last year. And lastly, PC 120 hearings and the 20-month timeframe to decision, that sort of broad process of an independent hearings panel that's already up and running, appointed by the council and the government, 9 members on the panel with chair, already starting to get quite active, very interested, as you won't be surprised to hear, about where this is all heading, and has sought some responses from council just to get some clarification already. So we have an independent hearings panel that will be unchanged, and the time frame through till next July for the panel to hear all of the submissions, any expert evidence, have its deliberations, make some recommendations back to council, and then for council to make decisions, all has to happen by July next year. That's this fairly strong signal from the Minister. There is a process by which that could change. It would require the Minister to agree to changing the time frame. So that's a bit of just the context. A little bit more of a recap in terms of how the council developed Plan Change 120 for those who were here and also for those who weren't part of that process, as well as those fundamental requirements under the NPS urban development, the legislative requirements around the 5 train stations. That didn't achieve the 2 million capacity requirement. That was well short of achieving the same or more capacity as Plan Change 78. So if the council just did those mandatory requirements on the previous slide, well short of the PC 78 capacity. And so the council had to apply a principled approach to achieving more capacity. And these are the sort of broad principles that were applied. Demand for housing in parts of the region can be, quantified, ranked in terms of which parts of the region have more demand for housing than others. We'd need to get our chief economist back. He's here if need be. Gary's here to explain a methodology around how the council determined across the region which areas are higher demand than others. Accessibility, we relied quite heavily on advice from Auckland Transport around how to measure accessibility from one area, one part of the region and another, and compare and rank different areas at a almost, not quite a property by property basis, but certainly smaller than a suburb basis. We were able to rely on AT's mapping methodology to develop an approach to which areas of the region are more accessible than others. And the reason for doing that, I guess, is the areas that have the higher demand, higher accessibility, on the face of it, would be more suitable for allowing more intensification, and the ones of lower demand and certainly lower accessibility, much more of a requirement to drive everywhere as opposed to walking, cycling, catching public transport, would be ones that were less suitable for intensification beyond those NPS urban development minimums. So that was one part of the methodology, and that was used to do things, for example, those walkable catchment requirements of 6 stories or more. In PC 120, there are walkable catchments around the metropolitan centres and the train stations and some of the busways that enable 10 and in some cases 15 stories based on a ranking of accessibility and demand. So that's the approach that you as a committee endorsed in developing PC 120. It meant that in some cases, to get up to that same or more capacity than 78, there are some walkable catchments that go beyond the government's minimum requirement of 6 stories and have the 10 and the 15 stories applied, beyond the 5 stations that the government has signalled the 10 and the 15. That went some way towards getting to the 2 million, to the same as PC 78, but was still short of the 2 million. So we workshopped with the committee other approaches, and a key one was increasing the amount of mixed housing urban zone, that's the 3-storey residential zone in the unitary plan, equivalent to the medium density residential standards, but in our view, a better set of standards. So to get that capacity up to the government's requirement for PC 120, the council had to increase the amount of mixed housing urban, and again, that was based on looking at accessibility and demand. And so areas that were more accessible, higher demand locations in the region are more likely to, in PC 120, show up as 3-storey mixed housing urban, and areas that are less accessible, less frequent transport nearby, less jobs and other amenities nearby would tend to have the 2-storey mixed housing suburban applied. So that was an approach that you endorsed for 120. In terms of those things that the council can use to restrict the heights to lower heights than the default NPS urban development, 6 stories, for example, qualifying matters. So the committee endorsed a range of qualifying reasons to have lower heights than those 6 stories in the walkable catchments, things like the Maunga view shafts, special character areas, reduced in extent the special character areas, but still retained as a qualifying reason to not allow the 6 stories right across the walkable catchments. And then last but not least, the council took the opportunity through Plan Change 120 to integrate intensification with putting some restrictions in place to try and reduce the risk of development happening in areas subject to flooding, coastal hazards, and land stability hazards. So Plan Change 120 could have just dealt with intensification, but off the back of the Auckland anniversary floods, Cyclone Gabrielle, new evidence coming to light, new technical work coming to light, the council felt this was a big opportunity to show in a single plan change how we're integrating, tightening up the rules and zoning for hazard areas and enabling more development as required by the government. So integrated plan change. So that last one was a council choice to put the hazard approach into the PC 120. Yeah, a lot to it, and obviously generated a lot of public interest with the 10,500 submissions, more submissions than the entire unitary plan received back in 2013. It received about 9,500 submissions. So moving ahead, and in light of the signals from government, in particular the Minister, the agenda report does recommend some principles to meet the Minister's request that the Council indicates how it would go about amending PC 120 if the requirement was reduced to roughly 1.6 million from the current roughly 2 million. So what, as officers, we're recommending is that we continue with that fairly tough approach to the most significant hazard areas, and that we do look to restrict the zoning, what we call down zoning areas that have the most significant natural hazards. We are recommending to retain the mandatory intensification in the walkable catchments. I think the word mandatory and retain, we don't really have much choice with that one. That is a signal by the government that that one isn't changing. Retain intensification that maximises the investment in the City Rail link. That does tie in with the government's requirement around the intensification around the walkable catchments of the rail network as a whole. So we do have the principle to retain that focus on the investment in City Rail link and the rail network as a whole. But in terms of where the council might sort of take the opportunity to have more flexibility, which I think, broadly speaking, the council was always very supportive of having more flexibility than the legislation was requiring. Where, as officers, we're recommending you might take that opportunity to reduce capacity or reduce density or reduce some of the heights. Could be a combination of zoning, height controls, but overall reducing capacity. As a starting point, once you go beyond a sort of 10-minute distance from the city centre, you do see accessibility at a broad level start to reduce. The concentration of bus networks, rail, employment opportunities, education opportunities within that 10 kilometres is significantly greater than beyond the 10 kilometres. It's a guide, and the principle that we are recommending is that that's the starting point. You look at the areas beyond that to begin with, and look at where some of the heights and some of the zoning might reduce in intensity or density as a starting point. Not the end point. We're not saying that there wouldn't be opportunities within that 10 kilometre radius for some to take advantage of flexibility. And that probably leads into the next point here, which is recommending reducing or decreasing housing capacity through looking at the frequent transport corridors. So, not mentioned on the earlier slide, probably should have been, but as well as the government requirements around the train stations and the metro centres and the city centre, in order to get up to that 2 million figure, the council did, in Plan Change 120, apply a 6-storey terrace and apartment building zoning down a number of the higher ranking, the more frequent of the bus routes in Auckland. We've had a lot of submissions on that. We've had a lot of submissions as council on a lot of factors. There has been a lot of commentary around some of the corridors that were included in that approach. So we are recommending that we revisit some of those corridors, and the ones that are lower ranking in terms of the advice from Auckland Transport might be areas where some of that intensification could be decreased or removed. And some of those corridors may well be within the 10 kilometres. I haven't got the analysis there yet, but that could be an example where there is a corridor within the 10 kilometre radius perhaps. We are recommending that at this stage in the process that you retain the approach to the qualifying matters. Extensive submissions on things like the view shafts, special character, other qualifying matters, really not, in our view, the appropriate time or process to start revisiting those things. Through the submissions, the hearings, council will have, and decision-making, the council will have an opportunity to revisit qualifying matters. But we think in terms of the time frame that's been signalled by the government, the approach that we took as part of Plan Change 120, we feel is robust at this stage in the process. Obviously, with the benefit of submissions and the hearings and the panel, things can change in that qualifying matters space. two more points. Our advice at this stage would be to still retain some buffer above the 1.6 million figure that the government has signalled. And the reason for doing that is so that the panel has a bit of flexibility, so that if it sees some really good submissions that would suggest reducing the capacity in an area, if the council's plan is already sitting at the the absolute legal minimum requirement, then the panel would have to do the exercise that this council faced last year, which was for every area of reduction, we have to offset it with an increase in capacity. So we are recommending that it may be a useful thing to do to not just get it to the absolute minimum 1.6, but to leave a buffer so that the panel has some flexibility. And last but not least, since PC 120 was notified, there is some new information coming through from our Healthy Waters and Resilience colleagues suggesting that there could be an opportunity for some additional downzoning in the most severely affected areas in terms of flooding risk and other hazards. So that's what we're recommending in the report. Moving on to the next slide with next steps, and then possibly a couple of questions from councillors that I can clarify. So the next steps would be, the Minister has asked for a response by 17th of March. I believe that's been taken to Cabinet shortly thereafterwards. The government is already starting to progress legislative change. We're aware from discussions with officials in the Ministry for the Environment that they are already well underway with drafting some legislative change. I think a key point here is that these principles that I've just described and that are in the agenda report are they're very broad. We're not recommending that at this early stage in the process that that the council should be locking things in too precisely and constraining itself over the next 2, 3, 4 months. That there are options that as officers we'd like to develop in response to these principles to give you choices as to how you might apply the principles, rather than trying to, with precision right now, lock in some principles, send that off to the government and perhaps constrain and have less flexibility than might be desirable over the next 2 or 3 months. As officers, we haven't had time to do the analysis on the pros and cons of various options and scenarios that sit within these broad principles. There is more than one way to achieve these principles that we put on the screen, and our strong advice is that those are the sorts of things that through workshops, questions from elected members, we can come back, give you more advice, and then confirm an exact approach for any amendments to PC 120. As I mentioned before, the government has signalled there would be an opportunity for those who are not involved to date to get involved in the process, and as we understand it, the hearings will continue working towards that overall 20-month time frame, which commenced towards the end of last year and concludes in July next year. So that's it in terms of the slides that I have. Some questions from councillors in terms of the report. There was just questions around clarification for the 3 tables in the report. So just to be clear, table 1 is a summary of the mandatory requirements that the Minister's signal will continue to apply, which I've talked through before. Table 2 is a summary of how the Council developed PC 120 to achieve that 2 million, because in just applying the government's mandatory requirements, we were still well short. The Council was still well short of the 2 million. So there isn't a recommendation that we lock in Table 2 in any way, shape or form. It's really just context for how PC 120 was developed. And Table 3 is a summary of the recommendations in the front of the report around how the Council might respond to the Minister's request to set out principles and other matters by the 17th of March. So that's the table. There's also a bit of a clarification around the principle of starting beyond the 10 kilometres, and does that mean if density is reduced or decreased outside of 10 kilometres, the council would have to make that up, offset that by more density within the 10 kilometres? The answer to that is no, because the reduction from the 2 million down to the 1.6 million means that the council has would have a lot more flexibility. You could reduce density outside of the 10 kilometres and not change anything within the 10 kilometres, or there is the option of reducing within the 10 kilometres as well. So it's that extra flexibility of the 2 million down to the 1.6 that means that reducing outside of the 10 kilometres doesn't mean to say you have to increase it. And the principle that's been recommended is start looking beyond the 10 kilometres, but through workshops there may be some good logic, good rationale to reduce density even within that 10 kilometre area that does have the highest concentration of buses, trains, employment centres, education, proximity to the city centre, which offers a wide range of things. So it's certainly not the case that any reduction outside of that means you have to increase it. And as I've said, there may be an opportunity or, through these principles to also look within the city, within the 10 kilometre radius. So those were the questions that we received, and I'm sure there will be plenty of others. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, John. And yes, this has been a very long 5 or 6 years of constant movement. So keen for us to land at least these principal directions to take to the government to see if they will change the law to then allow us to reduce some of this capacity, which many of the committee are keen on, and I know many in the community are too. So we've got some questions on the issues or process. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Chair. Look, thank you. It's trying to make the complicated as simple as possible, isn't it? So Aucklanders understand, the government understands, and we're all on the same page. Look, when we ran the public workshop on this, there were 4 principles that have somehow become sort of 20 resolutions. So I'm just going to try and ask my questions around that. Because at the public workshop, I asked the question that if we intensified around the major transport routes, the CRL stations and the CBD, would we get, theoretically, to that magical new number of 1.6? And I'm pretty sure the answer to that question was pretty much. I went back and had a look, and that's what you said. So I'm going to ask the question again, because I think one of the key principles here is that which the government asked us to do initially and that we agreed on, which is to intensify around the major transport routes, CRL stations and the CBD. So if we do that, would we reach that magical new number, which is less than the old number, of 1.6?
Through the Chair. So we need to be quite precise in our language here. So if the Council implemented the NPS urban development requirements around the train stations, the city centre, the metropolitan centres, the town and local centres, and the Council retained the approach under PC 120 to those areas, which wasn't just the 6 stories, in some cases it's 10 and 15, and the Council included the intensification along some of the frequent bus corridors, that package there, which is still quite a confined part of the Auckland region, and broadly speaking, Deputy Mayor, that is, as you described it, is the areas that have the good proximity to those large centres, the smaller centres, and the frequent and rapid bus stations and routes. That preliminary results from the modelling team would indicate we would be above the 1.6 million.
Okay, so that means that areas that didn't meet those criteria could be downzoned. You know, other suburban areas that didn't have those sorts of things could be. There was flexibility around that to potentially be downzoned, right?
Through the Chair, if in all other areas the Council just retain the unitary plan as it is, not downzone from the unitary plan, but retain as it is, preliminary results would indicate that that would achieve the 1.6 million. It's not necessarily the best outcome for Auckland. There could be other options that are better, and I don't believe it's ruled out as an option under these principles as recommended. But the short answer is that that would achieve the 1.6 million with not a huge amount of a buffer, but it looks as though that would achieve it.
So I think that's really important, because I think what Aucklanders are saying are their flexibility if we don't meet that. Now, my next question is, because it wasn't talked about in the workshop at all, is this new 10 kilometres number, which we haven't discussed, so to my understanding so far. If, as you have said in your opening comments, that 10K could be a decrease outside of that 10K and a decrease inside of that 10K, because, you know, why have it at all? Why are we actually mentioning 10Ks, and where did it come from?
Through the chairs, as I mentioned, that is, generally speaking, where you have the highest concentration of buses, train stations, employment, education on a regional basis. I think the words as a starting point are really important. So we're saying through the workshopping, we would, as officers, bring you some, an option that does that. We would give you an indication of what that means in terms of capacity. That might be 1.8 million, I don't know, it could be 1.7, it could be 1.9. And then as a committee, you would have another option, which is to then go beyond that. So starting point would be to say, well, what would that look like if the council reduced some of the intensification around some of the suburban areas, the centres, the frequent bus routes beyond the 10 kilometres? Where does that get? What does that look like in terms of capacity? Next step would be, well, what would an option look like that actually starts reducing some of the densities within the 10 kilometres based on good principles around, you know, more distant from some of the bus routes, even within the 10 kilometres. So it's really a starting point for workshopping options.
But it is a bit of a magical kilometre number, a bit like the 1.6, because it's, but you know, okay. And my last question is around the walkable catchments. Aren't they going to be reduced in size? Did we talked about that? When does that get decided on? Yeah.
Through the chair, our recommendation is to retain the walkable catchments as generally an 800 metre distance from the edge of the train stations, 800 metres from the edge of the metropolitan centres, and 1.2 kilometres from the edge of the city centre. There are lots of views on that, extensive submissions saying that's not nearly far enough, submissions saying it's too far. At this point in the process, we've done lots of workshops on this. We've presented analysis from all around the world, different ways of defining a walkable catchment, but our recommendation is to retain the 800 and the 1200. The approach to the smaller centres is a little bit different. We have a 400 metre distance from the smaller centres, and that we think is something that is potentially something that we could look at more carefully. It is within the scope of these principles here to look at, is the amount of intensification around the local and town centres the right level of intensification, and you know, should that be pulled in a bit, not necessarily the 400, maybe a shorter distance. In some cases, Phil's just confirmed we've set a 200 distance for some and 400 for others. Maybe some of the 400s should only be 200. So that's where I think there is some good workshopping to do on that. But the broad walkable catchments, we think that's a robust place to be right now.
Okay, and so I'll just stop now, if I can, Chair, by just going back to that really key point. I think that Auckland is, just to put it as simply as possible, that if we did the upzoning that we were required to do under legislation for the MPSUD, allowing for natural hazard down zoning, which is the central city and the major corridors, that's how we get to the magical 1.6 number.
Through Chair, that's one way you could get there. It's not necessarily the best way. And I did mention the frequent transport corridors, which are a council approach, not part of the NPSUD. So you would have to retain, based on our preliminary work, the frequent transport corridor intensification, the main bus routes, to be fairly confident of getting to the 1.6, as well as the NPSUD.
Okay, I'll leave it there, thank you.
Yeah. And I think there were some really good questions there, because even if you reduce the walkable catchments, then that goes below the 1.6. So then it's like, where do you fit that? So there, you know, as the questions are, you might be able to remove some of the outer bus routes, but you might be able to remove the in. But as the decrease of MHU, that could happen largely in most suburbs, as inns including.
That's actually, turn that into a question, and that's exactly, that's exactly right. Yeah, well, you just have, haven't you? So, but basically you're saying that you could easily reduce some of the MHU to MHS if you followed the above principles that I've talked about in most suburbs.
That's correct.
Because that's really what's pushed the government to reduce the number, I think. And if we can say that by our good friends sitting behind some of us over there in a simplest way, I think that's the key to it. Thank you.
Yeah, so the way I look at it and what is explained is, say, those first two are probably more aimed at FAB, not only FAB, but mostly. But the chair's rec that I put in after discussions with Deputy Mayor about the confusion is making sure that everyone knows that there will still be a target of reducing MHU in most suburbs, including within the 10 if they're not close to bus routes, etc. So that's, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, John, the kind of the direction under most options you'll bring back to us will have that in.
That's correct. Yep.
Thank you. Questions, Councillor Short.
It's already been kind of asked, the whole MHU reductions in certain areas, so would you like me to still ask?
Yeah, if
All
it's
right,
more
okay.
nuanced.
As much, because this is the big one. This is the big one, Victoria. So many people can ask the same thing a different way, because this is the
Okay.
answer.
So I totally understand why we're going to focus on in outside areas for the reductions, but I guess reframing the question, is it your assumption that most areas will still receive the reductions, especially in MHU areas?
I suppose it depends how far the council wants to go towards the 1.6 million, really. And through workshopping, we can look at the pros and cons of reducing mixed housing urban. So, but yes, the flexibility does allow for a fair bit of mixed housing urban to be removed. And in fact, to the Deputy Mayor's question before, our analysis would suggest that if you keep the intensification in and around the stations, the metros, along some of the bus routes, you could revert back to the operative plan, which does have mixed housing urban, but has far less than PC 120. So,
Thank you. Councillor Gillen.
Thank you. A couple of questions. The first one was similar again to what the previous two speakers have asked. But so in your answer to the Deputy Mayor, did you include downzoning for natural hazards in your figures?
Yeah, the quantum associated with downzoning for natural hazards is not really material. So even with an expanded approach to additional downzoning, it's still going to be in the order of 10 to 12,000 or maybe 15,000.
Okay. My second question is about the entire capacity number. So there's been a lot of discussion in the media and around this table about the 2 million versus 1.6 million, etc., and that it's not really a target, etc. But my understanding is that Watercare, Auckland Transport, Healthy Waters and other parts of council that are involved with infrastructure rely on the projected capacity in the unitary plan in order to plan for and deliver infrastructure. So, for example, Watercare will be looking at how much capacity the unitary plan allows for in a particular suburb when they work out how big the pipe must be, etc. So by having a higher capacity, even if it is, and I've heard comments like it's unrealistic, not going to happen for 30 years, etc., but having that higher capacity, doesn't that actually dictate to an extent how much we spend on infrastructure?
oh, thank you. Through the chair. Yeah, it'd be fair to say that right from the outset of this journey around increasing intensification with Plan Change 178, then 120, 80 in Watercare, and the council did express reservations and submission to the government around the huge uplift in capacity that these processes will be creating. And one of the arguments we made, or one of the positions we put to government, was it does make it more difficult to plan for and invest in infrastructure in the right place. So 80 and Watercare have been, and our other asset providers have been well aware of that for some time. Government as well, Ministry of Education, are looking at, well, if the planning rulebook, the unitary plan, is now allowing so much more capacity than even 30 years is likely to take up, how do we plan and invest in infrastructure? So they're looking at alternative ways of more modelling where the take-up is actually happening, getting more sophisticated about monitoring where development's occurring. You may have heard some of the team, perhaps not yet, talk about the Auckland growth scenario where we do modelling that takes into account not just the planning rules, but a range of other factors like demand, what's happening on the ground, and forecast, and do modelling to try and predict where development is happening to then help with investment decisions by the council and other infrastructure providers. So looking at moving away from just purely the planning rules to guide investment decisions, locations for infrastructure and so on, and looking more at predictive modelling that takes the planning rules and other factors into account.
Thank you. And I want to come back to the 10-kilometre line. And are you working on that as a circle, as a radius, or are you working on that as a bits and pieces around, but approximately 10 kilometres? Because, yeah, that's my first question.
It really is just a guide. At this point, we thought it would be a radius from the city centre, and a circle drawn around that radius. I guess the city centre is not a dot, is it? So it might have a little bit more expansiveness to that, but it really is a bit of a fuzzy edge. And I think once if the committee endorses that principle, get into workshops, we can bring you some options around that. Some that will have some decreases a little bit inside, some that will not.
Okay, all right. Well, working on that being a circle as such, are you saying that within that circle, so say this all passes and the government agrees, within that 10-kilometre radius, you will still see what is being proposed under Plan Change 120, and outside of that 10-kilometre radius, it'll revert or it'll stay as the current operational unitary plan zoning, more or less.
Through the chair, that is potentially an option within these principles. It's not the one that immediately springs to mind, but that is one approach. It could be a fairly hard and fast, only look outside of that, only reduce density beyond that. But the principle does say as a starting point, and there are other principles. In particular, I think the chair, you've noted overall reduction in mixed housing urban, irrespective of whether it's inside or outside. So the yellow highlight there doesn't specify inside or outside. So to your I guess, question there, I wouldn't anticipate us bringing forward an option that is as hard and fast and rigid as only reduced density beyond the 10 kilometres. And that wouldn't be exploring Principle 6 on the screen there. It wouldn't be exploring Principle 5 around corridors that might actually come inside the 10 kilometres. So...
Sorry, no, when you say that it doesn't specify inside or outside the circle, are you saying that could actually be inverse? So it's actually within the circle then that we're looking at a decrease, and outside the circle we're looking at an increase, according to what is currently written in front of us.
Can I just ask which specific principle do you think suggests that?
The 10-kilometre line. So when you mentioned that, I took from what you said that it could be the reverse of what's in front of us.
If we can bring up the 10 kilometres, so decrease, so it's decrease, it's not saying any increase, it's a decrease.
Decrease using the distance. Yeah, okay. All right, my next question is, under this, what happens with the special character areas?
Our recommendation is to retain qualifying matters, and special characters, just one of the qualifying matters, as notified, and focus more on the decrease in intensification rather than outside of those qualifying matter areas. So that's our recommendation in terms of these principles.
Okay, thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor, thank you. Councillor Newman.
Good afternoon, John and Phil. I've got a series of questions, but firstly, can I acknowledge what a challenging space this is to work in and a challenging time for you. So thank you for your patience and good humour throughout. My inquiries, which I sent on email, is probably more in terms of a clarification, because I sort of feel like everybody's in a low trust environment about this whole reforming at the moment. And it's not a statement about the officers, but I wanted to understand, if we go back to the recommendations, including the 6, if the lady could just switch it back, please. Thank you. So I would like to understand, do you have in your mind, or do you have codified somewhere, the rankings for the bus corridors that would reflect the higher ranking and the lower ranking? I'm not saying that I'm not trying to get you to produce a map by another means, but I mean, spatially, I'm thinking of bus corridors in parts of Auckland where they are just not a priority, because it might be a bus that comes around, every 30 minutes somewhere in the vicinity, but by no measure is that good access to public transport, and it certainly doesn't qualify from my thinking in terms of a high-ranked bus corridor.
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair, I don't think you'd be too surprised to hear me say I can't name the corridors right now. That's exactly the sort of thing we'd like to run through in workshops. And if you feel that there's some issue with the ranking, again, we can interrogate that a bit more and look at whether the ranking has some issues with it. So, yeah, we'd like to leave that to workshops.
Okay, I accept that. In the operative Auckland Unitary Plan, the objectives in the regional policy statement refer to good accessibility for all people, including by improved and more efficient public or active transport. And I agree with that. That's what we argued for. That's what Auckland has submitted on. That's what they. I think we all sort of declared a truce on that. But now we're trying to come up with a new sort of principles for how we respond to whatever the government is coming up with at the moment. And we're referring to good access to public transport and these ranked bus corridors. So how quickly could you furnish advice around this, noting that we can have more workshops, but I really want to understand how this reconciles with the RPS, because I suspect I'm probably generally in favour of this 10-kilometre rule option, but I know that outside of there, and even within there are most certainly locations where there must be downzoning, because by no measure is there a suitable public transport option that would justify the intensification outcomes.
Yeah, through the chair, one of the challenges again with this entire process has been that tension between the national policy statement directives and the legislative requirements around things like MDRS and our own Auckland regional policy statement. And we've, as officers, felt at times that there's a real tension there to sort of hold true to the council's own regional policy statement. That's the big strategic front end of the unitary plan. And the government's directives, there's a tension there. I think with this extra flexibility down to the 1.6, we start getting to the point where, there's stronger alignment. But I guess our overall approach right from the beginning is to try and stay as true to the regional policy statement as we can, notwithstanding those tensions, and continue to come back to policies like the one you mentioned and linking our principles back to the regional policy statement so we don't end up with a plan change that's at odds with the council's own Auckland regional policy statement chapter of the unitary plan.
And my final question at the moment, Chair, but I reserve the right in case I have more. So I agree with the retaining qualifying matters as notified, but just in terms of noting that the focus on intensification remains around the stations, where you get the intersect between the qualifying matters and the walkable catchments around the stations, how does that get reconciled?
Had a chat with Phil just before. Phil's going to pick this one up. Thanks.
Well, I suppose the first thing is that we're retaining that current approach to qualifying matters, and so therefore that relationship of the zoning for what the qualifying matter does, we stay true to that. And so we've got that with respect to the view shafts where they intersect across the walkable catchments, and we've spoken about the Mangawhau station situation in the past. For special character, we've had the approach through Plan Change 78 with the 66% and the 75% that we took, and then through Plan Change 120 when we got the additional requirements associated with the 5 stations, we've reviewed that position again as well. So we're not proposing to shift from that approach that we've taken of that intersect of the qualifying matters with those locations of walkable catchments or the 5 stations.
One more, Chair, if I may. How confident are we of securing this spatial planning revision as per these principles when the government moves to change the planning law? I am very, very concerned about a lack of clarity from the government as to whether these principles can endure beyond the next iteration of what the government, what a panicking government tries to do next. So how, I mean, are we requiring, as per a statement of our principles, that the government is confirming its commitment to codify those principles and the planning outcome that will derive from it, notwithstanding the new law that's being proposed? But how are we doing with that?
Yeah, so we've already voted on that as a committee through our RMA submission. We've been very clear that we want this to carry through. I spoke at Select Committee last week, again reiterated that, and I've spoken to Rachel Brooking and Chris Bishop, and I think the team have spoken to MFE as well. They've been clear, both government and opposition, they are looking into ways, and I think MFE have been clear, Megan can follow up, that they are looking into ways that we can sit slightly outside those requirements. An Auckland carve-out. What I have been clear, and you can watch back the Select Committee, that we don't want to be completely left out, because there are lots of things that this council may want to change or put through with the plan, combine the Hauraki Golf, things like that. So it's about how do we carry forward what we've done, but also still be allowed to do some revision, because I think that there are lots of things from 2016 that we still may want to change that we haven't had the ability to do through this. So it is looking how the requirements aren't so onerous on us to jump and kind of throw all this back up. Is that your understanding through MFE?
Yeah, through the chair, it really just is this transition provisions in the new system. How do they apply to Auckland? And so we said, could we have a conversation at the right time about what that looks like?
But we have supported this around that table already. Yeah, I mean around this table. Sorry. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Fletcher.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd reserve my right, I don't want to monopolise time, but if I can ask some questions now. Before I start, though, I just had a supplementary to one that the Deputy Mayor raised, and that was on the issue of walkable catchments, because I just need you to confirm, I didn't believe that when we were considering PC 78, they never really reached a finality on walkable catchments, because the caucusing that had been intended with expert agreements and so forth, that got cancelled by Auckland Council. So I'm just still finding it a little vague, that the distances around the walkable catchments and some of the readings that I've done about other experts and so forth. So could I just get some confirmation on the fact that we never completely landed on the matter of walkable catchments?
Thank you through the chair. The council absolutely landed on its position for the notified version of PC 78. You gave us clear direction as officers, and you endorsed the plan change that had walkable catchments of 800 metres approximately and 1,200 metres around the city centre. Yes, there were extensive submissions on that. PC 78, as we all know, PC 78 was put on hold as a result of the Auckland anniversary floods, and that walkable catchment topic may well have been heading into a mediation, and there was no further decision from the council at that point. So we are, I guess, revisiting that, but our recommendation is to continue to stick with the walkable catchment as notified, rather than change them at this stage.
Thank you. So my questions probably start from the point that the Mayor has made, in that he doesn't want to waste money and he wasn't happy about maps being produced before we actually got to the point that we found some agreement about how we were going to proceed. And so I'm, in putting questions to you, I am very concerned because I've had ministers confirm to me that Auckland will not get exemptions. You know, whatever work we're putting into this now, we might not assume that we're going to have exemptions. So I will want to see anything in writing to that effect before I would agree to anything. Because the reality is, and I remember in October, John, when I put to you whether or not what we, leading up to that point, had been good practice, good planning practice. And the answer you gave me then, that it probably wasn't ideal, that everyone was under time constraints. So I just want to put it in that sort of context, the questions that I'm going to raise with you. And also the tensions, you know, you've got the precision of language, but you mentioned before, but also the flexibilities that we can work with if we're going to workshop or do anything, and we need some practicality in how we go about that. So firstly, in terms of precision of language, and I'll ask Sandra if she could just pop up that slide that I sent through to her earlier. I have really struggled in all of the officer reports and the directions that we've received from, have you got that there, Sandra?
Just takes a couple of seconds to load.
That's lovely. Technology.
Just being transferred over from one screen to another. I can see it loading.
Right, that comes from the CRL website. So in the officer's recommendations to us today and in the report and in material from the minister, we keep talking about these CRL stations. But the reality is, in terms of the area that we're looking at as of the moment, there's only one CRL station, and that's Mungafo. And around that, we've got a whole lot of other stations that were already in existence. So I put that up just as a reference point for what are we actually meaning, and has there been some definition? If we're going to have precision on this, are we just talking about Mungafo, or are we talking about these other stations which seem to have been repeated so often that it's become part of the lexicon, that these are CRL stations, whereas for me, they are stations on the Western Line. And if you're going to start putting boundaries or, you know, some sort of distance, you know, on these, what do we actually mean by CRL stations? And is there a definition written anywhere over that?
Thank you, through the chair. And I think that's a very fair point there. You know, recommendation B2 in the report talks about the 5 city rail link stations. On the screen there, there are 4 identified as city rail link stations. When we're referring to the 5 city rail link stations in the context of this plan change, we're referring to the 5 listed stations in the Resource Management Act. And I think it's fair enough to question referring to them as city rail link stations. They are 5 stations on the Western Line. And I would accept that we should correct our language and not refer to them as the 5 city rail link stations. They are the 5 listed stations on the Western Line, 5 RMA listed stations. Because CRL stations, a definition of what is and isn't a CRL station, that's possibly a question for someone else, but that's my understanding. You've got them on the screen there.
It has
If
been
I could-
used colloquially by the government too.
Yeah. If I could just clarify, the minister call them that at the very beginning. So we've just been trying to be consistent with that language. But you're right, it's the Kingsland, Morningside, Bordelnav and Mount Albert and the Mangawhau are the 5 listed stations.
So I'm not wanting to be vexatious on this, but we have created this argument around optimising the opportunity out of the investment that we've made into the CRL, and then we talk about the CRL stations, but we've actually, to a degree, there's been a bit of misinformation there, because if you were going to put a 10-kilometre circumference around that area, you might look at a whole lot of other stations that were already in existence. The only one that I can see that has relevance to what we're talking about today, if we are to be precise about language, is Mangawhau. So could I ask that we get some correction on that we all know what we're talking about?
Definitely, Councillor Fletcher, and I think 3 still includes, I think, the broader definition, which is to retain intensification and maximise the investment in the city rail link. That can cover the other stations. But I think 2, and we'll work with the staff, needs to have the 5 stations listed and list them. So then it's, because that's what the requirement in the law says. So we just need to list those stations instead of calling them the city
So
rail
then
link.
the question will be for me, that will come through from constituents is, well, why just on the Western Line? Given that the CRL is actually about supporting all of Auckland, it raises a whole lot of issues that I can anticipate that people are going to put to me. But I'll just park that for the moment because, as I say, there's that tension between trying to be precise and also trying to keep the flexibility and also trying to keep the public well informed in what has been, for me, a pretty incoherent process. And that is in no way disrespectful to you as officers. It has been completely incoherent in what we have been asked to do, the time frames. At every level, there has not been the level of professionalism allowed for you to be able to come back to us. So the second question that I have is, can you identify for me a precedent where we've had submissions of such importance, where we've been invited to vote on something as elected members, where we've had no visibility, in this case on the 10,000 odd submissions that were tabled on the 19th or before, 19th of December. Can you give me an example of where we've done something of this magnitude, where we haven't had any visibility on the submissions whatsoever?
Well, through Chair, I can't think of an example. This change to legislation in the middle of a RMA process is, I think, almost unprecedented, certainly in terms of Auckland, my career, having a shift like this in the middle of a process, but that's the process that the government is signalling that it intends to take. In terms of the submissions, there will still be opportunities for the council to consider those submissions and particularly consider the recommendations from the hearings panel, who would have heard from all of those submitters. When their recommendations come back to you, you will still have a decision-making opportunity at that point in response to a panel that has heard from all of the submitters. So there is an opportunity there, certainly.
So, I just find it interesting whether the council has considered its own reputation, where we're requiring elected members to vote on something today where they've had zero visibility, whether that will have. There isn't a great environment of trust for local government at the moment, whether that will have an impact on us. And the second part to my question is, in light of that, has there been any pushback? And I'm not here to defend the government in any way, shape or form. Has there been any pushback to government that this is probably not best practice for Auckland Council?
I think that's not really an answer to staff, but I think it's been very clear. The pushback has been very loud. about this process. I think you've probably missed the mayor, definitely others, but the pushback for the flexibility pre-Christmas and through the regional deal plans has got us to the government changing their mind in January. We're in a process, so we either move forward with this process or keep with the current process. That's the two choices.
Chair, I accept that you're not wanting, and I don't want to compromise officers, but
Well, that sounds like you are. So.
In fairness, I submitted questions in advance, and I got a reply back saying, well, these are political decisions, basically. And I went back further again and said that we do have fantastically, great staff, and there's nothing to prevent them offering an opinion on whether there is any realism in terms of the timeframes that we're looking at. So I'm really genuinely trying to work within the processes of this committee. So my question would be, can officers offer an opinion based on their professional experience over what we are seeking to achieve, allowing for sufficient flexibility to be able to complete this within the timeframes that have been put to us?
Through the chair, I'm happy to answer that. So look, while this is an unusual process, as with legislation, anything can happen. So that's effectively where we're at, and we've yet to see the legislation, and that's why my answer is going to be probably unhelpfully uncertain to you, because until we are clear exactly what the legislation is, I'm not quite sure how long this could take. It could be done within the 20-month time frame, but I don't believe it can be done if we're talking about the normal kind of, public notification process that you would normally do with a plan change. I haven't seen the legislation, so I just don't know ultimately what we're talking about.
So another opinion I'm seeking from you is, given the amount of resource we've heard, how much money this has cost, 55 staff that have been embroiled weekend after weekend doing this, and the concern that we've got, that we've been told the government's RM changes are going to be with us within, and some are saying enacted within 3 months, would it be prudent, therefore, on this question that Councillor Newman put about, what are our expectations? I want to know from you that it would be important that we get in writing from the government whether or not there will be an exemption for Auckland. Otherwise, are we wasting our time with what we're doing right now?
Thanks, Councillor Fletcher. I understand your question. I've had a conversation with officials to talk about, the transition timeframe and the fact that I think it has to look different for Auckland than it does for the rest of the country because of the process that we're currently in. I don't think I would agree with your word exemption, though I think I understand the intention of your question. I don't know if Auckland should be exempt from the whole new system, but that is something that you can consider. But as I said, I've just spoken to the officials about what the transition arrangements look like for Auckland. So I think you and I are similar, but you might have gone perhaps a bit further than I would in terms of exemption, if that's what you're meaning by that word.
By exemption means the work that we're doing now, whether or not we have to go back to a blank sheet of paper in 3 months' time, and all of the work of those 55 officers and all of the costs that have been absorbed into this process are going to be thrown out the window.
Yeah, so no, that's I would agree with you then in the term of that exemption is that we should be there for. The way that I've framed it is that if we continue through this process and we get to the other end, that we don't have to just throw it up in the air and start again. So, and I've just used in terms of the transition arrangements, there can be something that can be bespoke for Auckland to ensure that doesn't happen.
Chair, as I indicated, I mean, I've got a lot of questions, but I just really want to have one more, and it's been asked in part already, but I would really like more detail behind the sort of thinking and science of the 10K. You know, forgive me if I'm feeling a little cynical, but because this whole process has been so incoherent to me, I'm rather surprised that suddenly we've got this magical number of 10K being introduced. So can you help me better understand it?
So through the chair, the best I can do is to restate that in general terms, inside 10 kilometres, there's a higher concentration of frequent bus routes, train stations, town centres, metro centres, and you have the city centre. With all of that package, overall accessibility is far greater than beyond it. But there's no more science than that, and that's why it's framed up as a starting point, so that going into the workshops, we can present a scenario that focuses beyond that, and a scenario that dips inside that. And as I mentioned before, there are principles recommended, and the amendment put forward by the chair doesn't mention the 10 kilometres at all. So there is definitely work to be done inside the 10 kilometres in amending PC 120.
If I'm to accept the logic of that, why has that suggestion not emerged before now in the earlier processes that we have been giving consideration to?
Through the chair, no particular reason between the workshop last week and just feeling that the very 3 or 4 bullet points that you got last week were just too broad and not giving enough direction. It seemed that a bit more of a focus around additional principles, expanding on what we had, not taking it in a radically different direction. The 10 kilometres emerged as a suggestion, as a starting point.
Thank you.
So just before we finish on that point, so I want to come back to as part of that point, you talked again about precision and language. I wonder where you've now put up, Chair, the recommendation of, can we just go back to the inclusion proposed by the Deputy Mayor of, under 6, here we are, good access. Could you define good for me, please?
Through Chair, that is a very challenging one at this point. I think, again, and I don't wish to defer everything to workshops, but it is through a workshop rather than a meeting of this sort, this early in the phase of amending PC 120. Through workshops, we would give you criteria to have some level of comfort around what good and not so good might look like from a transport point of view. If you may recall, through the development of PC 120, we had a mapping tool called the Framework for Urban Accessibility. That is one tool of defining varying degrees of access to transport, goods, services, education. So we could look at a trigger point, a threshold on the Framework for Urban Accessibility to define what is good and what is not so good. That's one approach. But in this bit of a reset around PC 120, we'd like to bring some other options that define the threshold between good and not so good. So I can't right now say a specific distance, but it may be that we land on a certain distance from a frequent bus route, for example.
Chair, I'm not wanting to put Mr. Duguid on the spot on this, but what I want to avoid is in the future, because it seems to happen with regularity here, is we're told, oh, well, you voted for that. We dealt with that, 3 months, 4 months, 5 months ago, whatever it might be. It's just left me feeling that I want the comfort of knowing what I'm voting for, because I do not want to be reminded that I might have supported something where I might have had a very different understanding of how that would translate. So thank you. I'll come back with further questions later.
Thank you. Councillor Williamson.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm going to try and just restrict my questions to one thing, because I'm actually almost comfortable now with where we've landed. I campaigned and fought a political battle to get that 2 back to 1.5. In the end, I was asked to my face, what about a compromise of 1.6, to which I said no. And then I was told, well, with what we're going to allow for in the CBD, you'll basically be a real 1.5 because we could do another 100,000 in there. So I want to ask the following. In a speech to the Committee of Auckland, the Minister said, I also want to talk about the CBD. While Plan Change 78 increased capacity in the city centre, the government believes there remains significant unrealised potential. Existing provisions such as setback requirements, tower dimension controls and height limits constrain development and should be revisited. Enabling more growth in the city centre will unlock productivity and increase the benefits of the CRL even further. However, for largely unfathomable RMA legal reasons, the city centre zone is not included in PC 120, and the council does not have a simple mechanism to unlock this potential. Therefore, Cabinet has agreed that I will start an investigation into these planning provisions that are holding back Auckland City Centre with a view to making regulations under the RMA similar to what we have just announced for Eden Park. My intention is that any additional housing capacity enabled in the city centre will count towards the new requirement to provide the capacity of at least 1.6 million dwellings. He also said on the day, because I've got a transcript of what he said to the media, he said, it's now up to Auckland Council to decide which parts of the plan will change or which suburbs will come away unscathed by density settings. Housing density will go ahead near transport hubs and rail corridors, and the government will also legislate to enable more housing development in the CBD. Okay, so my question now is just simply this. Will changes that he's planning to make to the intensification within the CBD allow at least 100,000 more dwellings, because then I get my 1.5 and I can rest easy, the battle is over?
Right, through the chair, I think it's probably good to just reflect first on what is the plan-enabled capacity of the city centre. So that exercise is going on at the moment against the decision version, which includes all of those controls that the Minister has named for review. That capacity is sitting somewhere between 40 and 60,000 dwellings. So not in the order of 100,000. Now, what extent of differential is then going to occur as a result of the sunlight access controls, the tower dimension controls and the height controls? We don't know. There needs to be that process undertaken. That process for Eden Park, it took around about 7 months to complete. It requires that sort of economic analysis of what those controls are doing, and it requires a process of being able to take it all the way through to completion and considering what council's position is on it. And so only when we get to that position can our capacity modellers begin that exercise. The intent is to enable for that to be concluded in time, that when all of this comes back for recommendations back to council and decisions to be made, that we will be armed with that further bit of knowledge.
Right, okay, so to ensure that I don't feel like I was hoodwinked, it would be possible with a whole series of the changes he's planning and hasn't done the legislative change yet but is going to, you would be able to get 100,000 more capacity out of the CBD, because if that couldn't be done, I've been hoodwinked.
Yeah,
We haven't got the criteria for it all yet and we don't know exactly how, but it could be done.
I think it is good to reflect on what is that plan-enabled capacity at the moment. And so for the whole of the city centre, the plan-enabled capacity sits for dwellings at somewhere between 40 and 60,000. To take that of the order of magnitude to hit 100 requires quite a substantial change to those provisions.
Right.
And so yeah, I think it'd be unwise at the moment to speculate that 100,000 would actually be the final number.
Okay, so you don't think, I'm trying to get with it, I'm trying to pin you down. You don't think it could be done, or you think it could be done?
It could be done,
Okay.
but looking at what the capacity is at the moment, it would require a substantial change to what the controls
Because when I read the Minister's statements about it, he's talking about that's how you'll get the number you want, Mr Williamson. You don't need to hang on to 1.5. 1.6 will include the 100,000 that we'll be able to do with the CBD when we change the legislation.
We also need to remember how the floor space in the city centre is used. And so what we do as an assumption is we look at a 50-50 split between the commercial use of floor space and residential use. And we also actually look at the same approach to the actual size of a dwelling, within the city centre as we do outside of the city centre, and that size is 120 square metres per dwelling.
But what about all those criteria I read out for you from his statement about the steps and the, what was it, existing provisions such as setback requirements, tower dimension controls, heights and constraints, should all be revisited? If all of that was revisited, you could get to the 100.
Minimal.
You could get there, I would call it a stretch.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Williamson. Any other questions? No. Councillor Lee.
Yes, it's a very interesting discussion about 100,000 dwellings in the city centre and the 1.6 million dwellings that we're required to provide. Instead of the 2 million we were previously required to provide for. But actually that has no actual linkage with reality. We seem to have become unmoored from reality. We have about 520,000 dwellings in Auckland right now, 2026, starting from some Nikau shacks and canvas tents in 1840. We've come that far. But now we're talking about 1.6 million extra dwellings. It is unhinged from practicalities, and surely we are practical people being serious here. So it is totally unrealistic to think that Auckland could support a population of 6 to 7 million people. But that's what the figures would suggest. That's a reality. But we don't, at the same time, we're saying, well, it doesn't mean anything.
We'll just get...
It doesn't really mean anything,
Are we speaking
except we're in a mad rush to achieve it. The question I want to ask is this. People have been requested, encouraged to write submissions on a plan change and do so in a real hurry. And it was the timeline was something the council determined, not really the government. Let's be honest about that. And so 10,500 or so did make those submissions. What I'm really concerned about when we talk about principles is what is the status of those submissions when we're talking about 10 kilometre distances, 6 kilometre circles around Auckland. Where is the natural justice and the integrity of a RMA submission process when we seem to be here deciding on significant material differences to the plan change we ask people to submit on? Where is the natural justice? Are we in danger of breaching this 10,500 submitters and their families' natural justice here? That's my question.
Thanks, through the chair. I'm happy to answer that. So we have made it very clear to the officials that are writing the legislation that whatever process is used needs to protect the rights and of those 10,500 submitters, so that if things are changed in the middle of the process, like it's being proposed, that all of those submissions will maintain their rights, they'll be protected, they won't need to do anything more if they don't want to, but there will be an opportunity for new submitters to enter the process. That was one of the expectations that the Minister has of this. So again, while it's unusual, through legislation these things can be done. So it's a matter of a fundamental principle for us, and I know you around the table, that the rights of the submission, the current 10,500 submissions, would be retained through this process. Again, because I don't have the legislation, I can't go into any more detail, but that is our expectation that when that comes out, that's what we'll see.
just to follow up, please, Mr. Chair. The officer's report talked about integrating, apart from dwellings, integrating other concepts such as hazardous areas, by implication, making space for water and so on. And I think Mr. Duguid referred to it as more of an integrated plan. But can I take it that that integration does not include the infrastructure to support a population of 6 to 7 million people, which is what the 1.6 million dwellings on top of the 530
Okay,
or whatever we have right now, around about that. Is the infrastructure integrated in this plan, or is it not?
Cool. I'll split it into two, if that's okay, Councillor Lee, especially for new members of the committee, councillors and Haukura members. Gary, if you could just give a brief, as tight as you can, what this either 2 or 1.6, or even the unitary plan number, what that actually means. That it's not, we assume, filling up every single property to the max, but I guess talking about what those numbers mean as a capacity, and what our expectation of dwellings is regardless.
Thank you, Chair. The general direction has been from the government to increase capacity, which is the potential number of dwellings that could be built if all of the enabled development opportunities were taken up and built to their maximum. Of course, we know that many landowners are not willing to sell their property at a point in time, and even if it is to be redeveloped, it may not be redeveloped to the maximum that our models indicate is possible. So given that uncertainty, I think the direction from the government is to enable more capacity than the number of homes we would need to deal with that uncertainty. The thinking is also that by creating many more development opportunities than we would need, we are creating more competition among landowners and giving developers more choice and giving people more choice. And so that's a downward pressure in terms of land values, in terms of having more competition. It also allows more flexible use of urban land. So homeowners can choose, if they wish, to purchase homes that use less land per dwelling. And so through those mechanisms, it's hoped that we can get more homes than otherwise and more affordable homes than otherwise. Thank you.
So the 2 million or the 1.6 is if...
Back on that,
I'll just get this down
Mr. Chair,
Councillor
we had
Lee,
that approach under the unitary plan in 2016 with about 1 million theoretical extra dwellings. It absolutely made no difference really to housing prices or demand. The fact of the matter is we are building houses in Auckland at the rate of between 14,000 to maybe 17,000 a year, because there is a real market out there, not just an economic theory market, a real market that requires real buyers and sellers. And so to be talking seriously and to be impacting on people's lives because of a figure of 1.6 million dwellings is actually nonsensical, really. It's not, to make my point again, misguided supply-side economics, adrift from the real market and ignoring demand-side economics is not going to cut it. But that is just a systemic failure in the whole process. Can I ask one more question?
Yes, I'll just maybe get... Councillor Lee, Councillor Lee, if I just get John to answer the infrastructure bit. So but Healthy Waters, Watercare and AT at least have given clear view on at least 78 versus 120, is that correct?
That's correct, Chair. Their preference is the approach under 120 as it currently stands to PC 78, which had a much more dispersed, unpredictable approach to density. At least in PC 120, there is more of a focus around the investment in rapid transit in the region. And I guess with the extra flexibility the government is signalling with the reduction to 1.6 million, it means potentially an even better alignment. But we certainly do take the point that we are planning for enabling far more development than is currently within the Council's long-term plan, for example, in terms of investment.
Thank you. And another question, Councillor Lee?
This is the last one, Mr. Chair. it's an excellent point made by Councillor Fletcher in teasing out what the 5 CRL stations actually are, and of course they are not CRL stations except for one, but apparently the Minister thinks they are CRL stations, and the Minister comes from the hut, and I think that the Council should email down a bit of a map like the one we saw to his staff to discreetly point out that Baldwin, the lovely Baldwin station, is not a CRL station, neither are the others, and therefore we shouldn't be parroting what the Minister's geographical ignorance, if I could put it that way. But it just illustrates, and the question is this council looking at public transport, rapid transit, CRL, walkable catchments, all things related to optimising public transport, walkable catchments in particular, in terms of optimising patronage, rail slots, how many services you need, and so on. What is the ideal figure? And the ideal figure internationally is 800 metres. We have gone to 1.2 kilometres in the city centre, and the suspicion is out there that this is not really about public transport, but about real estate. It's about location, 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 and therefore that is why there is confusion about using these public transport terms. Do the officers think that rather than undertaking conventional town planning and public transport planning, the council has been too much influenced by real estate and property development considerations?
I don't know who.
No.
That was a no, yeah. I haven't seen any real estate people around this table. The Councillor Winiata.
Here's one.
Sorry.
I feel extremely inadequate to follow up Mike Lee there, but I do have a question that kind of follows off on the back of the previous plan changes that we've approved, and it revolves around a term that came up at the previous meeting, which was unanticipated growth. With developers that decide to put through either a plan change or resource consent for whatever development they like, where they like. While we are looking at a 10-kilometre radius from the city centre, there's certainly nothing stopping any developer from planning what they wish to in any area they like. Is that going to be taken into account within the plan change, or are there mechanisms which will be able to account for that?
Through the chair, in terms of calculating capacity, any of those plan changes that have gone through and become operative do contribute, between 78 being notified and now, do contribute towards the capacity. That's in terms of the capacity side of it. Councillor, if your question is more around can we make it more difficult for unanticipated development to occur, we can't do that through this plan change. It would have to be through something in the legislation itself, either the fast-track legislation or the replacement for the RMA.
Okay, thank you.
May I take a supplementary to that? What advocacy...
I'll just go to Councillor Turner and then...
Apologies.
Yeah. Councillor...
Defer to the supplementary first.
Councillor Fletcher, yeah.
So when we're looking at this out-of-sequence situation, which seems to be far too common, what advice have you given your counterparts, the officials, with regard to this particular situation? Have you raised this consistently with the ministers, with MFE? Has this become part of your advocacy in and around these recommendations now?
Through the chair, not in the context of these recommendations, but generally, two officials we have for years raised concerns about unanticipated development and the infrastructure costs and challenges and the difficulties in funding and financing the infrastructure to support that type of development. Yeah, there have been some government responses through the infrastructure funding financing legislation. There are ongoing discussions, but I do believe it's at a political level that there will need to continue to be discussions around that challenge that Auckland in particular faces, and I'm sure other cities, regions as well, with development getting consented approved and the difficulties in providing the infrastructure in an affordable way for that development, but not so much in the context of this topic here.
Thank you. Councillor Turner. Last question.
Thank you. Just on the back of Councillor Lalee's last question, one of the things that perplexes me the most with this is that it's just an open field. There's no real constraints in there in the way that myself and most of the public consider town planning works to say where stuff happens. And when we were discussing that some time ago in one of the meetings or workshops, and and it was argued that people would go to certain places because the market forces would drive them there. And I think you, sir, with all respect, had a map of the most desirable areas in town, and it had been built on the value of the land. And you were challenged on that, okay, you pull down some of those and bang up something else, might no longer be the most valuable area in town. But you didn't call it the most valuable area in town, you called it the most desirable area in town. And if I got it right, we were using that as the reasoning why we'd see the intensification happening there. Is that correct?
Through the chair, yes, councillor, I think you're recalling the sort of heat map of demand, the pattern of demand across locations for housing, and that was based on land values per square metre. And the thinking there is that when a location is in higher demand, developers are very aware of that, and they've got more confidence about the product that they're trying to sell, that they'll have more chance of selling it, because the higher demand means that more people will be willing to bid into that location to get access to what it offers. So the idea is that higher demand locations tend to be more commercially feasible, depending on what's already built on that location, that is. So opportunities that are already fully taken up, less likely to be redeveloped, of course. But where there's opportunities where the capital intensity, the buildings that are on the land are relatively low to the value of the land, then they'd be more likely to be redeveloped if they were to come up for sale.
What about Kaingaora? They don't fit into that.
They'll have their own objectives about how they maximise their current land holdings and how they might transact other land holdings, but I'm not party to that, so I couldn't comment. Yeah.
So so you can understand my concern. No, it's not a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Henderson, then Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you. I've got 4 questions. I'm going to start with a very basic one, but there's been some misunderstanding around the term enabled capacity. Could you just, for the record, explain what enabled capacity actually means? Is this actual homes being built or not?
Through the chair, it's a theoretical number of the sites that have been enabled through the zoning to have more housing, and we estimate the maximum that could be built. But that does assume that they would be sold and developed to the maximum, of course.
Thank you, appreciate that. Just second question, picking up on the questions from Councillor Fletcher and Councillor Lee, because I think they made some very good points around the process. I might reach a different conclusion to them, but I want to kind of extend their reasoning with you. We asked the public to submit on 2 million. Then it got changed before the process was even finished, and we haven't even seen the submissions. Given it's a capacity figure, because we've just explained what that capacity term means, and we haven't seen legislation either, we're in the middle of a process, would it not be sensible to just stick with the 2 million figure? I just don't understand the advice to drop to 1.6. Because it's a capacity, so the panel can choose to drop it to 1 point whatever they like. Isn't that reasonable?
Well, if I could answer through the chair, my reading is that you have optionality here about what you do. I guess the capacity is the figure that is the anchor or the policy objective, but in making decisions around that, I think it's good to take into account the trade-offs. So the reason why capacity is being considered to be higher, or the direction is to increase it, is to enable more homes to be built, so increasing housing supply. So you can think of that as the potential benefit of increasing capacity, but then on the other hand, when we try to achieve something, that comes with costs. We have to give up something. And so there are perceptions around what that will mean in terms of the negative externalities on neighbouring properties. And so those are the, it's a simple sort of articulation of the trade-off before you. So having evidence around those real-world impacts in terms of homes versus externalities would be a consideration that I'm sure will come through the workshop stage.
I understand all that. What I'm just trying to drill down on is why have we been advised to drop it from 2 million to 1.6? Because I need to explain that to other people. What would I say to them?
I'll happily answer. Probably two elements, Councillor. First of all, we are assuming that you want to respond to the Minister's letter. Remember, the Minister has written to you and outlined the fact that he will be changing legislation and he would like a response as to how we are considering, how you are considering achieving that. So that's our first assumption, hence why we're here. The second element, though, is that we would expect, like under normal circumstances, if there were no changes, if we chose not to do anything, the Independent Hearings Panel is going, as council, is going to ask us, what is your response to the new framing that the government's put in, or the new legislation? So one way or the other, we think we're going to be asked, and so we felt it the right thing to do would be to do that now. It's your decision clearly about where the parameters lie, and once we see the legislation, it'll be clearer. But one way or the other, we're going to be asked, so yeah.
So the choice for this body then is to stick to the process that we've told the community we were following versus respond to a minister's letter. Okay. I don't have that incorrect, do I? Okay, cool, thank you. I got two more cues just around water infrastructure, because we've been talking a lot about transport. Water is just as important in terms of infrastructure for new homes. So Watercare released maps that showed capacity for wastewater and stormwater across Auckland for future development. For those that maybe didn't see them or weren't here, could I just, I hope this isn't unfair, but could you explain what those findings actually were? Was there capacity for the Central Isthmus to take on more homes from a water perspective?
Through the chair, over time, yes, but right now there will be some neighbourhoods, some streets within the Central Isthmus that could not, that do not have sufficient capacity for the level of intensification that this plan change, or even the operative unitary plan would allow for, if those opportunities were fully taken up and fully realised. So outside of the RMA, outside of the unitary plan, Watercare does, in those situations, have the ability to refuse a connection where there is a situation on a street, in a neighbourhood, where something is getting ahead of the ability of Watercare to invest and provide the infrastructure in that area. So I guess in short, at full build out, even under the operative plan, there are some areas, even in the central part of Auckland, that don't currently have the pipes with sufficient capacity, or the pump stations with sufficient capacity for that full build out under the operative unitary plan, let alone the plan change. And that's something that Watercare works to ensure that over time they are providing that infrastructure for that level of development.
I'm sorry, I'm just a bit confused by that advice there, sorry. Because I'm looking at the network capacity map right now. Everywhere in the Central Isthmus in this map says area with capacity, or in some cases, a few suburbs here and there, area with capacity closely monitored. Are these maps incorrect, or what's?
No.
I don't understand.
Through the chair, just to be clear, there is capacity. That does not necessarily mean there is capacity for a full build-out scenario under the planning rules.
I'm not sure Councillor Henderson was meaning full build-out. We're not expecting that.
So there is capacity, but
The first question was, we're not going to be building homes for 7 million people, so that's not what I'm asking with respect.
Yeah,
sorry. I've got the map in front of me. I'm needing some expertise here.
Would you like some help from my perspective? Because I know that places like Parnell will struggle to be at full capacity, right? I know. There is some capacity, but not full capacity. A renewals budget for water care in the isthmus, certainly in Ōrākei, is quite significant.
Thanks, I appreciate that, and I hope that wasn't an unfair question. That's really interesting, and it goes back to that question of enabled capacity and what that term actually means again. My last question is, we've clearly seen the CRL as a big impact on your advice, which is awesome. Did you also consider in your advice the impact of the central interceptor investment?
Through the chair, not directly. Central interceptor certainly increases the wastewater capacity in the western part of the isthmus. We're well aware of that. Some of that would contribute towards just the potential under the existing operative plan. But no, in short, that's not something that's driven these particular principles. They're not guided by central interceptor.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for your answers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. The last question is Councillor Filipaina.
Tēnā koe he mana, and just ngā mihi kia koutou katoa to our kaimahi, to our staff. My first part is, are we in the position we're in now based on the letter that Mr Mayor received by the Minister?
Through the chair, that's correct. I think, as Megan has just confirmed before, that's the prompt for bringing the report to committee. Yep.
And that letter, and everybody's got it, basically outlined he was going to introduce amendments to the Resource Management Act. And then he actually said in his letter around the 2 million dwellings to 1.6 million dwellings. Am I correct in saying that?
That's correct, and he has asked for a response from the council to give an indication of how it would respond to that. Yep.
And that response is needed to be with him by the 17th of this month.
That's correct.
And also, he expressed in his letter the frustration that he felt, but more importantly, me reading the letter, the frustration that it is on Auckland Council. Can I also confirm that? I can read it, but I think everybody's got a copy of it.
I believe he's expressed a general frustration with the length of time this process is taking. Not at Auckland Council. I think it's just generally with the process. But yeah.
Okay, I want to move now to your PowerPoint. And in that PowerPoint, you mention principles used to achieve PC 120 housing capacity, also recommended principles amending PC 120. The next slide was next steps. Can I assume that what you want us to do, and that's taking into account the next slide, the next steps slide that you mentioned in there, is to give us the time with workshops to look at how we end up getting to a decision around principles used to achieve PC 120 housing capacity and also recommended principles amending the PC 120. You're saying to us, as a process, let's work it out together, and you still have that 20-month hearings process. Am I correct in that, or is that the process that is not going to happen?
Thanks, through the chair. That's a good summary. It's obviously your decision whether you respond to the Minister's letter or not. It's your decision as to whether you amend PC 120, but as staff, we're recommending some principles so that you can start the work towards potentially improving PC 120 through workshops.
Yeah, so there's still a lot of work to do from our perspective as the elected members. And my last part is, you mentioned in the next steps committee workshops to set more detailed direction for staff, but there's no date associated to those particular workshops. When do you think, over what period, would those workshops be to give you detailed direction?
We're working to try and find some dates in your diaries on the assumption that you will endorse some principles today. As staff, we're ready to get going on this. We think we can probably start workshops within the next couple of weeks. So we're talking something pretty soon, potentially March and certainly through April.
Yeah, staff can't really second guess a time frame of things if we don't make a decision today. So the faster we get principles to the minister, the faster we get legislation and understand what we can and cannot do, then we will do our best to find times we can all get to start reshaping. But we don't know at all what the legislation yet will say. But if we don't make a decision today, there may not be a change in legislation, etc.
My last part, I supplementary to what you've just said, Chair, is that I know that with hearings within unchanged 20-month time period, I'm assuming it'll be before the 20-month time period is up. Yeah, so I look forward to those workshop dates because they are the ones that are going to be important for us moving forward with that letter that was received by the Minister Kilda.
Thank you. And in discussions with staff, this is, if there was going to be a change, which is fairly unprecedented, it's probably the perfect time for that to happen while the hearing hasn't started yet, etc. Councillor Watson, then Deputy Mayor, will really cut off the questions there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. One kind of general question maybe to the Council Economist and the other one to do with the Minister's letter. And it has been very instructive listening here, been a lot of good questions. I was just reading the Grey Lynn Residents Association newsletter just put out at the end of November last year in terms of Plan Change 120, and they used the words hope and theory, and I actually have heard that word hope repeated here today. So the whole basis of the NPS Urban Development Plan Change 120, the notion that by going, huge amount of development capacity, there will no longer be a premium on high density zone land because there's so much of it. And then the theory being that developers can buy it cheaper, which will enable them to build higher density, which in turn will lower costs. So at the end of all this, there's this lower cost that's meant to be driving it, or I assume. However, when you dig a little bit further, yeah, sure, upzoning is one part of affordability, but there's about 5 main areas. And one of the important ones is inclusionary zoning and affordability mandates, which we did skirt with briefly and very unsuccessfully with the special housing areas, retained affordability and inclusionary zoning. There's none of that in any of this from coming via the government, is it, in terms of inclusionary zoning and affordability mandates that were pretty much discredited when we last tried them? Is that correct?
Yeah, through the chair. We haven't heard inclusionary zoning or mandatory affordable housing in the context of resource management reform, and that's where you would expect to hear it. So it's not something we've heard from the government, but they're looking at allowing councils to have those sort of rules and plans that require developers to provide a certain proportion of dwellings at a price point that would be deemed affordable.
Okay, so I guess what I'm sort of getting at there is the hope and the theory is based around just the one part of what should be actually a suite of proposals, if affordability indeed is the end zone. And just further to the Minister's letter, and his very last phrase, he refers, looking forward to work constructively with Auckland Council, blah, 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 and a Plan Change 120 that, quote, reflects the views of Aucklanders. Now, I've heard him use that a number of occasions. He's been on TV getting interviewed and saying this plan change will reflect the views of Aucklanders. So we hear ad nauseum the directives that are given to us that we quickly jump to whatever the latest one happens to be, and this is no aspersions on the officers, they're just following through on the league. It's more aimed at the political side of things, I suppose. So we've got our next step we've just been chosen to jump to. But in terms of that repeated
notion that reflects the views of Aucklanders, A, how serious is he about that? Because he's repeated it a number of times now, and they've made this change of tact, one assumes, as a consequence of the views of some Aucklanders, influential Aucklanders, fair enough. To what extent are we able to actually test that in our communications with them? I mean, these figures are pretty random, aren't they? 2.07, 1.6, 1.5, 1 point, I mean, what does it mean? It's a theoretical capacity that we've said it just hopefully at the end of it enables more development and cheaper prices. It seems to me that we're almost falling at the first hurdle because we're not actually following through on his offer and getting a true sense of what reflects the views of Aucklanders. And we're not going to do it in this latest change because we're probably not even going to have an insight into the view of the 10,000 odd bods that have already spoken.
Maybe I'm happy to take that through the chair. So what I intended to say, if it wasn't clear, was that we do want the 10,500 submissions to be retained, all the rights to be heard at the hearing and all of that kind of thing. Some of the submitters may change their minds. They may like what they see in the new version. They might not like what they see, but nonetheless, they will still be able to be part of the hearings and give their views. The Minister has also said that he does want the ability for new people that are not part of the process to come in at this point as well. So I think with the combination of existing submitters plus new ones, that's partly the views of Aucklanders. The question then is, though, any other engagement that the council wants to do, and we are expecting that the legislation will enable us to do some engagement. The question is how much and when and for how long. So taken all together, I think that is his. That is a reflection of what he means by views of Aucklanders. I don't have any other insight into what else he might be thinking of when he uses that phrase.
So we can, final question, Mr. Chair, we can see the mess that the Minister is making of this. I mean, it's a sham, it's just bloody shambolic, I mean, let's be honest. But we ourselves, we turned down the opportunity for a pre-notification consultation on the plan change, didn't we? And I think that's starting to prove quite crucial now, because if we'd undertaken that process, which I think we were told was best practice in planning, we would be in a much better position now to be responding to the latest U-turn in the road.
Thank you. A last question, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. Look, getting this, understanding that regardless of where you may sit on all the recommendations, you might love them all, you might be a bit dubious about some. This is really more about math than maps, right? So am I correct in saying that if you don't vote for these recommendations, you stay with the 2 million? Would that be correct?
Pretty much.
One word answer is fine.
Yes, sorry, I didn't realise you were asking me. Yes.
Thank you. Right, so I'll get you to step away. Right, we've got a bunch of amendments that have come through at the last minute, so it is difficult for everyone to now navigate that, but we will try to deal with it. So I think we'll have a 5-minute break to look at the amendments, but yeah, so well, yeah, the mover and seconder would have been nice to organise that earlier, but they're going to print them out, I guess. Councillor Henderson.
Sorry, Chair, just for clarification, so I've got one here from Councillors Gillen and Fletcher. Is that the only amendment, or of the others that have come through?
That's one that just popped into my inbox
7 minutes ago,
so
yeah.
that's all I know at this stage, yeah. But there are quite a significant number of changes, so I'm assuming it will take time to question the mover and seconder, so
And 3 pages
we
long,
will have
yeah.
a 5-minute break, bathroom break. Yeah.
To get a printed version and bathroom?
And we'll try our best to get a printed version, but it's, yeah.
Thanks, boss.